Good day, my beautiful children. Today is Tuesday, May the 19th, and we are going to be talking about, wait for it, hold on. Africa. So if we were in class together, I'd play the whole song for you guys and we would just rock out to the soothing sounds of Toto. I hear the drums echoing tonight. Cheers and whispers of something. Do. All right, I'm not gonna do the whole thing, but yeah, we're talking about Africa, and not a lot of people know a whole lot about the Dark Continent. And I called it the Dark Continent for really one reason, and that was until the 1800s, most of the civilized world had no knowledge of what was going on inside of this wonderful and incredible, strange, diverse place. So here is Africa. And by the way, if you look at this map was made prior to Africa being explored by Europeans. And so if you look, the only places that have been mapped out are coastal. And that is because during the age of exploration, Portuguese and Spanish explorers traveled the coast and mapped the coast out and set up trading posts and other areas. So they didn't know anything about the interior of the continent, which is crazy because it's freaking huge. So in 1914, this is what Africa looked like. And if you look, I don't think we did this map with Mr. Frank, but this is usually a map I use for imperialism because 1914 was a really important year. It was the year that World War One began, which you guys knew, I'm sure. And you can see how by 1914, Africa had been carved up and piece by piece and had been colonized by major European powers. So you don't need to know anything other than each color on this map represents a different European power, and that they had every square inch of the continent now by 1914 locked up and were exploiting it for their own use. So this is what Africa looks like today. And again, it is huge. It's landmass. It's ginormous. And most of you, and I would include myself here. At one point, I knew all the African countries and could name them all. I can't anymore. I doubt very many of you could either. We just don't know much about Africa. Not Corona. Frog in my throat. And we don't talk much about Africa in class. So let's do it. Let's talk about it. So the first thing you should know is that Africa is ancient. I don't care what your thoughts are on evolution, but we can all agree that the earliest humanoid fossils, the oldest fossils ever in the world, have all been found in Africa, in places like Olduvai Gorge and other places like that. It's basically the cradle of mankind. The first man probably originated in Africa and then moved from there. And then, for millennia, for thousands and thousands of years, it's not like Africa, nothing was going on until Europe showed up. They had all kinds of interesting and vibrant culture there, and but we just, nobody knew about it. So we'll start here. During the era of exploration and colonization and imperialism, between 1600 and 1900, Europe came in and they carved up Africa for themselves. And during this time, this is when the era of slavery came into being, at least in terms of the American colonies in Europe. Now, slavery has existed long before the Europeans went to Africa looking for labor, but the slavery that you learned about in schools, the slavery that impacted the United States, it originates in Africa. One of the terrible things about the slave trade is that there's nothing good about it for anybody. But these Europeans, they wouldn't go into the interior of the African continent because it was too dangerous and unexplored, and so they set up these trading posts and these slaving outposts on the coastline. And a lot of times, didn't have to go out looking for their own slaves from Africa. What would happen is tribes would be at war with each other, and they would capture prisoners, and then the African tribesmen would take the slaves, or take the prisoners to the slaving outposts and sell them to the Europeans. And so that's a really dark chapter, obviously. And don't get me wrong, this is Europe's fault, and then later America's fault. This is not Africa's fault, but that is part of the story. One of the main things Africa was exploited for was its gold. And if you remember our discussion on mercantilism, there's this idea that there's only so much wealth in the world to go around, and that whatever country controls more of it has more power, because you can use gold to buy things like ships and soldiers and other things. And so they exploited Africa for gold and diamonds and other jewels, and still to this day they still do that. They also exploited it for rubber, which couldn't grow in Europe and was needed for truck tires and things like that, and other things. So Africa was exploited for its natural resources and its labor. Anyway, fast forward into the early 1900s, and you get a lot of people, including some Europeans, that are arguing for something called Pan-Africanism. And that is the idea that Africa should become, or it's free and independent, and get rid of all the European colonial powers, and govern themselves, self-rule. And so this movement started slowly and was helped by two world wars, which weakened several countries to the point where either they lost, like Italy and Germany, they lost their land holdings in Africa, and they were stripped from them by treaties and given to other countries, or larger countries like Great Britain, who could no longer maintain colonies all over the globe, and just slowly began to give up and grant freedom to those people. We saw it happen in India, where the British granted India independence. It's going to happen in South Africa and other countries and other areas in Africa as well. So speaking of South Africa, we use them as kind of a case study. So South Africa was colonized by the British and also the Germans, or the Dutch. I'm sorry, and that's why if you go to South Africa today, you'll see it's dominated by black Africans, but there are also a lot of white South Africans, like Charlize Theron is South African. Anyway, these European settlers called Afrikaners, they went down there, and they exploited the native Africans and took their land, and created their own political system that they obviously ran and took control of, and operated under a segregation system known as apartheid. And I mentioned this in the Gandhi unit. That's why Gandhi went to South Africa, because Indians there and other people of color, including Native Africans, were oppressed by the white Europeans that were living there, and that's why he went there in the first place. So they had segregation in South Africa, and they had it up until really recently. When I was your age, South Africa. Oh, actually, no. By the time I was your age, South Africa had, I think, gotten rid of apartheid. But I remember as a kid seeing messages about ending apartheid and getting rid of segregation. They had segregation up until the 80s, 1980s. Anyway, in 1912, slowly but surely, the native Africans of South Africa began to gain power. They created an African National Congress in 1912. And by the 1960s, which coincides with the civil rights movement here in the United States, there were a lot of demonstrations by native South Africans against these apartheid laws. And the leader at the time of the African National Congress was a guy named Nelson Mandela, you may have heard of. And Nelson Mandela was arrested under false, um, charges, and he spent something like 30 years in prison. And during that time, there was a lot of unrest and armed resistance and riots and violence associated with this. Eventually, apartheid was overturned, and Nelson Mandela became free. They let him out of prison. And I remember that. I'd watch NFL games when I was like in middle school, and every once in a while in the crowd, you'd see somebody holding up a sign that said "Free Nelson Mandela." But anyway, Mandela became free, and he became the first black president of South Africa, which is a huge step towards, um, evening the playing field there between blacks and whites. But if you look at this is in Durban, South Africa, is a major city, and on the beach here is the law, the apartheid law at the time, which said under Section 37 of the Durban Beach Bylaws, bathing area is reserved for white members only, and that's something you would have seen in this deep South or in the United States up until the 50s, and you saw in Africa until the late 80s, in South Africa until the late 80s. So they were way behind the times. So here's Nelson Mandela, who has since passed away. And this is a guy named Bishop Desmond Tutu, who was another, when Mandela was in prison, he was another leader in South Africa that fought for native black African rights. All right. So as these African nations began to one by one gain independence from their European colonizers, it left a power vacuum. And as we've seen already in history, that leads to usually a mad scramble for who's going to be in charge, and can be lead to violence and other things. You're going to see that all over Africa. So almost all of these African nations have adopted some form of democracy as their new government, but they've had some issues. There's been a lot of corruption, and things like that. Most of the new leaders of these independent nations were from wealthier families or middle class families, and almost all of them had been educated at some point in the United States, so they knew about basic capital, tenets of capitalism, and how our economy works, and also about the way our government is run. So most of these new nations end up being governed with some basic form of democracy as their government. Not all of them, but some of them, most of them. All right. So speaking of the economy of Africa, Africa is known for many things, but one of the bad things it's known for is its poverty. Large segments of the people of Africa are incredibly poor. Now, you got to understand, depending on where you go, if you go to certain places in Africa, they have cities and communities that are every bit as modern as anything you'd find here in the United States, if not more so. You have very wealthy people, but you have a ton of very, very poor people. Um, and so that has led, most of them took to capitalism, or at least tried it, but some opted for socialism. And why? Because socialism appeals to the have nots. And if you have a country full of poor people, they're going to probably opt for a system that at least grants them some guarantee of wealth or property ownership or whatever. So there have been some pockets of socialism, not full on communism, because the United States fought really hard to stop that, and so did a lot of other European countries. But at least some form of socialism. A lot of these nations still rely on a single cash crop or a natural resource for their exports. That's not great. If the price of that crop or that natural resource is high, then that's awesome for your country. Your economy is going to be booming and it's going to be fine. But the minute that either the crop fails or the price of that natural resource bottoms out, your entire economy is going to crash. So you see that with countries like Venezuela, in South America, that are oil dependent. They depend on basically oil for the vast majority of their economy. Well, when oil prices go down, their entire economy crashes, and that's what happens a lot in Africa, for countries that are dependent on one product or one resource. As far as industrialization, Africa has been very slow to industrialize. And why? What did we learn early on in class? You need three things in order to become industrialized. You need land. Well, they've got that. That includes natural resources and space to build factories. They have that. They need labor, workers. They have that. What's the thing they lack? Capital. They don't have money to either start up industry, or even if they start them up, they don't have money for the people living in Africa to purchase products made by that industry. So that's been the biggest issue. So you see this a lot in the machine and tech industries with Africa. They have to rely on countries like the United States or other modern countries for all their technology because they don't make any of it themselves. And if you're reliant on another country, that's bad because that leaves you at their mercy, and you have to basically do what they say, or else they won't give you the stuff that you need. And the other big issue is with Africa, population growth. Uh, Most Africans are either unable to afford forms of birth control or not educated on it, and that has led to a giant population explosion. As Africa modernizes and their health systems get better, although they still have a lot of issues there, but babies live to grow up to be adults, whereas before the infant mortality rate was very high. Well, when the infants live, that creates more people, and more people creates a bigger burden on an economy, and so that's been a major issue too. And there have been some other issues associated with this population growth and other things that we'll get into later. But long story short, the economies of many of these African nations are very poor. That has led to a lot of poverty and crime and other things. Not everywhere in Africa, but in large segments of Africa, that has been the story. All right, so that's it for today. Tomorrow we're going to come back and continue our discussion on Africa, modern Africa, and talk about its role in the world today, and also the United States interaction with Africa, which has been sketchy at best in a lot of cases. We've done some not so great things and failed to act when we should have or could have, and let some bad things happen to people. But we'll get into that later on this week. So that's it for today. Signing out off here. Peace and love. Miss you guys, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.